event about to start shortly.
Welcome everyone to the Wilson Center. I'm Meg King with the Science and Technology Innovation Program, which studies and translates advances in science and tech and their impact on foreign policy. Woodrow Wilson was no stranger to massive technological change and the policy challenges they created. When he was born, railroads still didn't cross the entire country. When he was in college, Edison invented the light bulb. He saw the promise in radio, and as a private citizen delivered the first remote live radio broadcast from his house here on S Street in 1923. And a month later, President Calvin Coolidge would deliver the first presidential address by radio. And on his watch, the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was created, later to become what we know today as NASA. Plus, Wilson was a governor. So gathering today on the final day of Cybersecurity Week to talk about how cyber threats are bringing geopolitical challenges to the doorstep of our states is fitting. It's easy to forget that states are on the front lines preserving and protecting America's most sensitive computer networks. Many of them run by the states and in the states, as we talk about massive data breaches and destructive cyber attacks carried out by both sophisticated criminals as well as nation states. 3 states are represented on the stage today. One more is coming, to share what they're seeing in the cyber threat landscape. On-the-ground experiences in Michigan, Indiana, and Louisiana are critical to understanding what we can do to improve the enterprise of American cybersecurity. Each has experienced their fair share of ransomware. That's a form of digital blackmail in which a cyber adversary encrypts your data until you pay a ransom. Website defacement by terror groups, university systems hacked by nation states, and even a voter registration database breach with some data put up for sale online. Today's event would not have been possible without a partnership with the Governors Association, who persuaded our panelists to join us, and the convening and intellectual firepower brought to us by the University of Southern California. Each of our partners will say a few words of introduction, and then I'll introduce our panelists and kick off what I hope will be a lively and informative discussion. So first, welcome to Maggie Bruner, Program Director in the Homeland Security and Public Safety Division at the Governors Association, where she leads their cybersecurity work.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you to the Wilson Center for putting on this great panel and recognizing the importance of states and hosting us here. I also want to thank USC for their continued partnership. Cybersecurity is an issue of utmost importance at the state level and to our nation's governors. That's why we're committed at NGA to raising the level of importance of this issue and doing it in a bipartisan fashion. In 2012, we put together the Resource Center on State Cybersecurity, and that is currently chaired by 2 governors, one Democratic, one Republican, Governor Snyder and Governor Edwards. So we're really grateful to them for bringing their representatives here today. We also have been working with Indiana in a long-term policy academy, and it's been intense and focused on a couple of different issues, including cyber disruption response planning. So NGA will be sticking around afterwards if anyone would like to chat, but we're really looking forward to this discussion and just want to thank everybody here for participating. And next, I'd like to welcome Adam Powell. He is the Director of USC's Washington Programs and Project Manager of the Internet of Things Emergency Response Initiative at the university.
Thank you, Maggie, and welcome to a pre-election cybersecurity and end of Cyber Week forum. I'd like to thank our partners, the National Governors Association and the Wilson Center, which is joining us and hosting this event. For the past few years, USC has been engaged in a cybersecurity initiative involving the schools of communication, engineering, business, public policy, and law, because it is not just a single discipline that is facing this challenge. And working with the National Governors Association, it has been a wonderful experience because with NGA, we are reinforcing every day the notion that one size does not fit all. There are 54 jurisdictions, each of which is very different. And the second great advantage of working with NGA is that the states are truly the laboratories of democracy. And so what we'll hear today from these 3 states is how they are inventing on-the-ground solutions outside of Washington and New York and Los Angeles, which really provide best practices from which we can all learn. So thank you for coming, and Meg, over to you.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned, we have Indiana joining us shortly, but I will introduce our three panelists now, and leave Chartrice to the end. But Major General Michael Stone is the commander of the 46th Military Police Command and serves as Michigan's dual status commander for domestic response situations. He's responsible for Army armories and installations, strategic communications, strategic level cyber initiatives, and National Guard employment initiatives. General Stone was commissioned in 1989 and received his current rank of Major General in June 2017. Prior to his current position, General Stone served as Assistant Adjutant General of the Michigan Army National Guard and Director of Joint Operations for the Michigan National Guard. As a member of the Guard, Stone's deployed 3 times, serving as a military police officer in Iraq. As Indiana's Cybersecurity Program Director, Chartrice Mosley works collaboratively with public and private stakeholders to administer the state's cybersecurity strategy and policy through the Governor's Executive Council on Cybersecurity. Prior to her current role, she was the Executive Director of External Affairs for the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission and oversaw the Commission's Continuity of Operations Plan and Emergency Management role with Indiana's Department of Homeland Security's Emergency Operations Center. She also served as a steering committee member and advisor to IDHS, that's the Indiana Homeland Security Department, as the agency developed and implemented the first of its kind CRIDEX tabletop and operational exercise. Perfect timing. Welcome, Chartrice. I just introduced you.
Oh, great.
I hope I got it right.
No.
Colonel Kenneth Donnelly has served as a commissioned officer with the Louisiana Army National Guard since 1992. Over the course of his service, Colonel Donnelly's commanded the 224th Engineer Brigade and New Horizons Task Force, the humanitarian mission to Haiti. He's currently the Chief Information Officer for the Louisiana National Guard and the Senior Coordinating Official for the Governor of Louisiana's Cybersecurity Commission. Donnelly is also the recipient of a Bronze Star, Combat Action Badge, Meritorious Service Medal, Louisiana Cross of Merit, and Louisiana War Cross. So, let's jump right in. Can each of you give us a snapshot of the cyber threats you face in your states and what you're doing to address them? And General Stone, you want to start?
Sure, absolutely. First of all, I want to thank NGA for this event in the Wilson Center. I think I need to start with, some people get confused about the National Guard and cyber. Remember, we have this beautiful constitutional framework, 10th Amendment, the National Guard, the militia. Our commanders-in-chief are our governors. And, of course, our National Guard is predominantly federally funded. And, of course, you know, today everybody's used to the fact that National Guard units deploy and continue to deploy in a federal status. So first and foremost in Michigan, I'm fortunate because Governor Rick Snyder came in almost 8 years ago, former president of Gateway Computers. Cybersecurity was a top priority. He immediately saw this as a threat, gave us an outline. Back then we had threats and we had problems and denial of service and things along those lines. But of course, everybody here I think is well educated in the millions of attacks that occur every day on state databases on those problems. But we established 7.5 years ago in Michigan a framework. He clearly envisioned the Department of Technology Management budget in Michigan, the Michigan State Police, the National Guard having this relationship. We sorted out in the first year a state cyber strategy, a state cyber response framework. Through that strategy, we built a couple of things. The Michigan Civilian Cyber Corps was created out of that. A lot of philosophical debate and inputs from other states that were trying different models. Think of it as a civilian cyber, like fire department for cyber. To respond, we created the Michigan Cyber Range, which we can talk a little bit about later, for unclassified, specifically targeting creating clusters for industry and going after workforce development but defending networks. But as a state, we've seen everything from the denial of service, the ransomware is already suggested. And I'll just say this briefly, that even during the Flint water crisis, Anonymous declared war on the state of Michigan. That was fun times for cyber when you're dealing with doxing and sophisticated non-state actors like that. So I'll just kind of close there, and I know we'll get back to it. So.
Perfect. Thank you. Chartrice?
Yeah, And thank you so much.
This building
for
is
the
amazing,
introduction
don't worry.
and then just like walking into it. That's really what I planned the whole time. I only made like one taxi driver really confused, and then made a couple people. Poor Michael heard the honks from me running across the street. So I mean, when it comes to state of Indiana, I think I mean to the generalist point. I mean, when we have it starts from the top, right? I mean, so when you have a governor who has made it a priority, I think, and recognizes the threat is real, recognizes that it's something that we have to address, then it really becomes, at least from our perspective, how do you approach it, right? So every state does it a little differently because every state is made a little differently, right? And different types of people, different types of leadership and so on. So from our perspective, when we started this under then former Governor Pence, and then it was continued through executive order with our current Governor Holcomb, we kind of had to look at it from we looked at it from a larger ecosystem perspective. So what was like a 40-member council, Cybersecurity Council, turned into a 200-plus member council, and that wasn't because I was bored. It was because we were seeing a lot of these, like the breadth of it, but needing the depth of it as well operationally, right? And so, and Michigan's been such a fantastic partner because one, they're an easy drive, and from Indiana, but more importantly, they've been doing it for 8 years now, right? So I, from the get-go, was like, hey, any state who's doing this, what are you doing? Lessons learned, what is not working, what is working? Because when it comes to cyber, I think the largest challenge that we have is how do we break it down to the normal person as to why that executive or that operations person should even care about it, and then what do they need to do, and then further of what they need to do, how do we simplify that? Because you have a lot of people who are like, oh, you just follow NIST standards, right? And you follow these standards and you follow that, and the normal operations person's like, all right, so but do I have to? And what does that even mean? And it's all Greek to them, and so how do we move it from why we know it's important and really actually make it relevant and pragmatic and down to the level of the regular people who may not ever hire a chief information security officer because they don't have the money, right? So that's kind of, from our perspective, we are as strong as our weakest link, and with cybersecurity interconnectivity, we are going to be that as a state, but not only a state, the larger sectors and the larger companies who can afford the cyber people are still nervous because in some way, shape, or form, they're connected to the smaller entities that are that don't have the cyber person, don't even know that they have a problem. And so how do we actually really from the first recognize that there's a problem, and then what are the solutions? So it's kind of where Indiana has kind of approached it from our point of view.
Thanks for allowing me to be here today. From our perspective, the governor's made this a top priority within his administration. And the Louisiana National Guard has been doing a lot of things within the cyber realm really since about 2012. We have a defensive cyber operation element, which is a 10-man team. And we also have an ad hoc cyber defense incident response team made up of about 40 Air Guardsmen and 20 Army Guardsmen and 20 Air Guardsmen. And we have several partnerships that we put in place. One was with the Cyber Innovation Center, who has 50,000 square feet of SCIF space, which gives us the secure capability to go in and look at all of the intelligence that's going on and to share that with all our mission partners. And we also have a relationship, a CRADA agreement with LSU, and we constructed at LSU in Baton Rouge a cyber range, which was the first of its kind at the time. And we brought all our industry partners in, and we've done collective training on a quarterly basis with some of our energy providers and our critical infrastructure providers. For us, the critical infrastructure along the Mississippi River is critical. We have the sixth largest producer. We're all the sixth largest producer of crude oil and fourth largest producer in the natural gas, and historically home to a lot of natural disasters. I know everybody remembers Hurricane Katrina. During that time, a lot of activity took place in the cyber realm, even back then, where we had to look and see what was going on when they tried to deface a couple of parish websites, tried to take down the LA Gov website. So all of those things that have been going on, we've started to build up and ramp up our force structure within Louisiana to meet the demand. And then the governor, back in December of 2017, set up the Louisiana Cybersecurity Commission, which brought in all the stakeholders from the private and public sector to include academia. And a lot of the governor's cabinet members participate on that commission. And General Curtis, who's the Adjutant General of Louisiana National Guard, is the co-chair. And since that time, we're almost into our year anniversary now within the commission, and they set up 8 committees, 8 standing committees, and one of them's in incident response and emergency preparedness, where they created our what we call ESF 17, which is our cyber incident response plan. We have a formalized plan now that we're exercising and plan to continue to exercise it as we move forward. And there's a couple other things where we're trying to, fill on a commission. The governors took the whole cyber ecosystem and established goals and priorities to try to make us a national leader in cybersecurity. So with that, I'm just fortunate to be here today, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
So I'm sure each of you can add to this list, but I see 3 major targets in the state cyber threat landscape. Obviously, and it's been mentioned, elections and their related systems. You've just mentioned critical infrastructure, which Symantec says last year increased by 29% in the number of vulnerabilities affecting industrial control systems, like those switches turning electricity on and off. And commercial businesses in your state who need help, but whose problems don't rise to the federal level. Anything you'd add to that? Do you agree, disagree? What are your thoughts on kind of the big threat picture in your states?
So I'll start, maybe we'll just go right down the line. Let's go to the third one first, commercial. So one of the things I did not mention that many states are doing is Governor Snyder created a CIO kitchen cabinet. So those top 50 corporations are invited in quarterly. They sometimes come to our Air Wing, to our Cyber Operations Squadron. We give them briefings. Many of them have clearances, get them read in, and there's a sharing. So that's more of a corporate informal as opposed to a state ISAC type response. And then let's talk about elections for a second. So I'm very fortunate in the Michigan National Guard. We're doing almost nothing for state elections right now. And I say that very carefully because Michigan State Police has the lead. We've decided in our state, we've created a Michigan Cyber Command Center. We're in a support role to them. We've decided deliberately that we want the Guard to always be in a support role. You don't want military people on keyboards. We follow the OSD policy, the acronym CTAA, Coach, Teach, Assist, Advise. We're always standing ready. But we're also fortunate in Michigan, we were able to recruit back David DeVries, our state CIO, who is the former acting CIO at OSD. So here's a guy, who's in the Pentagon at the top, that pyramid. But what we do is we have regular calls, we have regular video conferences with other states, and we're all cross-talking. Where every state is different, every state constitution is slightly different, how they're structured. Some states, the Secretary of State reports directly to the governor, and others that are elected. Election and how it's done at the local level. So we're cross-talking and looking, and what we're seeing is, and I'll shout out a couple states. Washington State, for instance, had a great after-action report. They went out just to coach, teach, assist, advise, and saw vulnerabilities at the local level to make recommendations in the election process to make things more secure. They're not out there, they're not going to be out on the front line in uniform during the election, and you don't want them to be. But I think the Guard, with our training and our skill sets, brings a unique asset, and every state CIO has got to make that recommendation to their governor and their Secretary of State of how to use those assets. And there's been much more collaboration and discussion and prioritization all the way from Cyber Command down, asking what do you need, what help do you need, through the National Guard Bureau saying, do you need extra money for resources to bring people on orders? So the states have been given the opportunity really for the commanders in chief, the governors, to ask for that help if they need it, where it's needed. So I'm just, to close, fortunate in Michigan, we're standing ready to assist in cyber, but so far, we have not been officially asked.
I mean, so for the state of Indiana, I've actually been so lucky as a cybersecurity program director for the state in which our Secretary of State, Connie Lawson, it's an elected position, but she has been amazing, her and her team on our council. It's one of those unique things where our council is not just, it's kind of like a combination of public, private, academic, military. Our adjunct general most certainly is one of the top leaders of it. But then you have our Attorney General who's elected, our Secretary of State who's elected, sitting on there as well. And it really, some states kind of struggle when you start crossing the elected officials across the board. So a lot of people, I get that question, how does that work, especially when it comes to a topic like elections, where, you know, sometimes people want to own that story even though it's not their story. And I would say that one of the successes of our council and the way that we've approached this is that, you know, everybody kind of appreciates everybody's lanes. So when we have 20 committees, and every committee, they are known as the experts of that committee. So we have an elections committee that is chaired by our Secretary of State, and the amount of work that they've done over the last year has been tremendous. Now, I would say elections is kind of a unique one, right, for all states, because they had to go, unlike energy and unlike water, wastewater, into the SCADA systems that you were talking about, and then certain types of businesses that have regulation. You know, elections got, you know, declared they are critical infrastructure and had to go from 0 to 100 very quickly to get to that component and that momentum of what a critical infrastructure is expected to do within the security aspect of it, not just the physical, but most certainly the cyber as well. And so to hear the states kind of share information and figure out, you know, okay, so we have to do this very quickly. They did, you know, it's great that the federal government gave them money to do it, but there's a mindset to critical infrastructure too, right? I mean, there's a culture of I'm a critical infrastructure, so therefore the responsibility is higher to do A, B, and C. And now you have to go to local level, local government, municipalities, counties, and kind of change that culture there within there, where they also see it as very much their own. And so it's a very complex thing. When people talk about election security, it is not as simple as big corporations being told by a regulator what to do and therefore they do it. You're talking about people who, one, don't understand the word cybersecurity. You have to demystify it, but most certainly they're just still trying to wrap their head around what does it mean to be a critical infrastructure. And so that's been, I think, on the rise of most certainly the threat picture, but most certainly, at least in Indiana, we've been very lucky to have such a strong leader in taking that on. You know, and she was one of the very vocal persons about being against being called critical infrastructure. I mean, she was on the Hill, everything like that. But when it was clearly realized that that wasn't going to change, she and her team jumped on board, and went with. And I think that there's a lot into character that says, all right, may not agree with this, but it is what it is. So let's do it the best that we can. And so we have a great committee and great staff that have done a tremendous job in addressing that, along with the other critical infrastructures like energy and the SCADA systems, and so on. So,
yeah. So Louisiana, like Michigan, really doesn't have any support requirements right now with the election. The National Guard is on standby. We are in close communications, with the Secretary of State, and we are working as a National Guard to look at what the bi-directional flow of information looks like between a state and federal partners, so that we can share information. So to know what a government response would be to the election, most of that, would be done at the local level. So the National Guard does have cyber capabilities. If asked to support, we will support. And I know that we're looking at, several things with the DHS on the commission. We have election security committee as well on the commission. And the Secretary of State is tuned in with our National Guard and all of the leaders within the state. So we're going to see, where it goes from here. But I do know that we do have the assets within Louisiana to be able to provide support, whether it's resiliency reviews. We've done some of those vulnerability assessments and risk assessments within a state. We've brought our critical infrastructure partners on the energy side and looked at risk and vulnerabilities and looked at how we need to do to mitigate some of those things. So it's the same process within the election process. And right now we just don't have any support requests that's coming from the state, the Secretary of State yet.
And Meg, if I can build on that just for the audience, because I know that this is a very DC-centric audience. So let me describe a couple states' structure for you, because you're not hearing Fed. So in our state, I said the state police have the lead for Homeland Security. That natural relationship, we know that Michigan State Police has the lead with the Department of Homeland Security. Mm-hmm. They have the lead with the FBI. Wisconsin The National Guard in that state, the Adjutant General is what we call a super tag, has Homeland Security, and they have the lead with DHS. So Indiana, I think, is like Michigan, where
Actually,
Oh, yeah,
we
sorry, the
have
Department of
we have a
Homeland
whole
Security.
we have
Department of
actually an
Homeland
executive Department of Homeland Security.
So each state, because of their constitutional framework, is structured differently, but don't think for a second that we've taken the federal help and response out of it. We follow the national response framework. We're all trained in the incident command system, which is federally mandated, local, state, federal. One of the talking points I want to get across is when you look at the definition of interagency within federal government, it means between federal agencies. And then they always talk in their doctrine about working with state, local, tribal. But when you talk to somebody at state level, county, or city, they always think interagency is city, county, state, and federal. It's a mindset. You have to explain when you come to D.C. that interagency doesn't mean just between federal departments. So all of our laws and a lot of our programming and funding are driven towards what can the feds do. And you know, hopefully somebody's here from DHS. They do an amazing job with the resources they're provided by Congress. But I remember a decade ago, they announced they're creating these CERT teams that were going to be able to help. Our state kept asking, what's the 1-800 number for your region, FEMA Region 5 CERT team? Well, Congress never funded them. They announced the program, but they never funded them. Now they have CERT teams, but they're very, I appreciate DHS's honesty. We can come if your state asks with a CERT team, but there's limited capability and bandwidth.
Yeah.
And so when you realize, if you're in DC or if you're a member of Congress and you don't drill down, you're not on that committee yet, those are things you don't realize. Where is the federal response? And so a lot of what we do in the Guard especially is we've got a role in state and federal is, you know, there's a lot of federal assets, and when we work through our planning, our exercises or events, the real question is who needs to know and how do you ask for more help and follow that framework.
Yeah.
Hopefully that helps.
Yeah.
No, and I want to say we have a unified command group structure with the governor. You know, the governors have immediate response authority. So at the local level, I mean, you're not going to wait on federal assistance. I mean, you're going to use the assets that you have within a state to go and do triage on whatever it is that the issue is in a CTA environment, and then provide that subject matter expertise, and then look at the reach back capability of what the technical experience that you need. And, you know, we have a lot of that in the state, but there may be something that you would have to be in a situation where you would ask for federal assistance. You know, so, you know, we're lucky we're not like Colorado or the Atlanta hacking where we had to exercise that, you know, in real world, other than a couple of, you know, simple things. Most of the stuff that has happened within the National Guard enterprise right now is people trying to, you know, download unauthorized software, and we disconnect them from the system and, you know, take that software off their program. But we do have, you know, a cyber element within the National Guard Bureau for incident response, and we do exercise that within the, you know, and that does report all the way up to the NCIC, you know, so, you know, I think that
That's the operations center at the Department of Homeland Security here in Washington.
right. So I do think that, you know, that the state is in a position to assist the local level if something should happen. So we'll have to see if there's anything that generates a need for the National Guard, because we are just in a support role. Thanks.
And if I'm sorry,
No,
ma'am,
go
but,
for it.
But at the NCIC, the National Cybersecurity Information Center, operated by DHS, if you've ever been, you will see all of these screens on the wall with all these different databases. A lot of that reporting comes from the state. They don't collect that and generate it themselves. They're actually generating it from California, Michigan. I think Indiana, you provide some data to them on a daily basis. So a lot of what they aggregate is
So
actually
there is
state.
information sharing. It's just
There's
not
information
all via
sharing.
the private sector.
But one of our frustrations from the state is there's no mechanism for them to share it
Down.
back.
Yes, this is a residual Homeland Security problem, which we were very aware of after 9/11 with intelligence, and it's unfortunately continues. But there are many people trying hard to fix that. So the names Cozy Bear, Cunning Kitten, Stone Panda sound a little bit more like cartoon characters than their official title, which for those who don't know is Nation State Advanced Persistent Threats. They're carrying out attacks on electric grids, voting databases, universities, you name it. And then there are the non-state groups that have affected some of your states, like terror groups that deface websites to spread propaganda or collect information on some new targets. I've tried really hard to think about an analogy to the global cyber threat that your states face. And the closest I've come, maybe you have one, is trade, but that's not quite right. Tell us how you're thinking about these big geopolitical threats. Are you getting the help you need from the federal government, which understandably is limited, but this should be an area where they can help you? Shatrice, you worked at the Indiana Utility Regulatory Commission during the time when Russia hacked the electric grid in Ukraine.
Yeah.
I'm sure you paid a lot of attention to that. Can you start us off
Yeah.
and tell us how you're thinking about this?
Yeah, I think, when we're talking to utilities, especially when the Ukraine event happened, and I think it's very easy in our cozy worlds and in state where we feel very safe that we still forget, I think, when it comes to cyber, that you don't need to personally be there to affect something, right? The ones and zeros cross, there's no real... There's no borders, there's no international borders, there's no state borders. So it's a big reason why it's so important, at least from my perspective, to work closely with fellow states, because when a cyber attack occurs, it will cross borders, and we're going to have to not only figure out how to best communicate with the federal government, but how do we best communicate with each other, right? That's why those relationships are so key. When we look at, and I think it's easy when you hear all these things, especially, not just the Ukraine from they took them down for months. That was a huge component and loss. And the electric community, energy community was, I think before that was very confident. You hear about, somebody, they're going after energy grid, and you have a lot of energy companies who are like, we're good, it's fine. And then that happens, we're like, we're still good, I think. Let's go double check that. And then if it happened, what would we do? And that really started up a lot of conversations. It's actually how I got into cyber, was starting the discussions from that at the Regulatory Commission. Because as a regulator, you kind of realize, energy is a good example in the sense that they are already very regulated from the federal perspective, national perspective, and then at state perspectives, depending on what state and how that goes about, right? Every state's a little bit different. And they are really a lot of times the best of the best when it comes to the practices that they do. But that only stops at a lot of times only the investor-owned utilities. In other words, the really big names you hear, right? When it comes to the rural ones, they don't have to follow. They can opt out of a lot of those type of regulations, including security regulations. And so that starts becoming an issue. So it's not going to happen to me, right? Like as with every kind of pandemic or epidemic or crisis, you hear it across the ocean and you're thinking, that's not going to happen to us. We're fine because we're America, right? And I think a lot of times when I'm in these briefings, when I'm talking to people, there are a lot of very, very smart people concerned because they're like, that's just practice for the one that they're want to do here. And that's the concern, is we should most certainly take note of anything that's happening internationally, because a lot of times when you start tracking the actors and the kind of groups, those groups have very clearly made it very clear that they want to take the Western world down, or they want to take a specific aspect of our country down, whether it's transportation or those critical infrastructures. And so it's important to not only make those relationships across the seas and figure out lessons learned there and how can we do better over here, but as importantly, build those partnerships within, because when it occurs, we're going to need to rely on those, and that should not be the first time. So when something happens and it crosses a state line to Michigan, that should not be the first time I have talked to Michigan as a cybersecurity director. So that I think is the thing we have to keep in mind, and the preventive aspect of it too, right? Because a lot of times those after action reports really talks a lot about how they weren't prepared prior, right? And so when it's always very interesting when I sit on these panels, because I'm either like surrounded by super tech people or military people, and today, two military gentlemen. The thinking of military versus private sectors, to your point earlier about information sharing, 100% different, right? It's actually a struggle. So it's a matter of figuring out what is the middle ground in which you respect the lines of authority and those frameworks, while at the same time understanding that they're not going to share it with you, nor should you require them. You should just have a relationship with them, and we're humans. If you have a relationship with them, they'll share to what they can, and it most certainly help in the prevention of those types of things and provide us, I don't know, maybe some good tidbits from a state and executive level that we can then provide to the weaker areas that we need help with.
I do not envy you guys. You've got a lot going on, yeah.
So I can build on that. A little factoid for you in relationships. For instance, Major General Vadney, my boss, the Adjutant General of Michigan, used to command the 32nd Infantry Division in the Indiana National Guard. Major General Corey Carr, Indiana Adjutant General, used to be on his staff. Ohio, Michigan, Indiana share force structure and brigade combat teams in that division, and we share a cyber protection team in the Army. So that was a deliberate decision to cross state lines, and I understand Louisiana shares
Mississippi and Texas.
Mississippi and Texas. So we've got National Guard force structure in cyber across state lines intentionally. But I do want to go to the hacktivist response to your question, and I will tell you this amongst the states. Major General Danner, the Adjutant General of Missouri, was one of the first adjutant generals to use his soldiers and airmen in civil disturbance responses to riots and seeing hacktivism, and doxing. And then from those lessons learned, Maryland, Baltimore riots, the Adjutant General of Maryland gives a great account of what happened in all of the hacktivism that was occurring. And from that, the Air National Guard built this great playbook. And then when we had our cyber incident with Flint Water, I was using Maryland's playbook. And it was, really who needs to know. Cross-talking. Every day I was on the phone with the J36, the National Guard Bureau, who was then in contact with U.S. Cyber Command. And, us folks with clearances understand the relationships that happened on the high side at Cyber Command, what authorities they have and don't have. Our incident was all local. It was all political. It was local. I think only one time in about 3 months did a single slide make it all the way up to the commander of U.S. Cyber Command. There was never a need for a federal response. But they monitored it. We reported it. It went through state police, FBI, DHS, NCIC. So there was a monitoring there. And I'm confident we would have gotten federal help if we had needed it, if there was a federal nexus or a federal demand we couldn't support.
Which leads me to my next question. So there are some skeptics who say that the capabilities of states don't match the threats that they're facing. You started to answer that question. Can I get just a perspective from the other two? In the face of very sophisticated cyber actors who intentionally, as in the Ukraine case, used decoys. I mean, they carried out a denial of service attack against the call center in Ukraine so that the electric grid operators couldn't tell how many people were affected. I mean, how do you think about this? Luckily, from a military perspective, you train for this, but how are you two thinking about it from the Louisiana and Indiana perspective?
I think that's a very true statement. States alone cannot take on cybersecurity. We it's a consistent I guess talking point with my council members, which I think provides a lot of respect then for the process of what we're trying to do, is that the state of Indiana should not own cybersecurity. It is not going to be solved or prevented by one entity alone. It requires private industry, who typically are leagues ahead when it comes to tech, when it comes to information. Now we have our military side who then gets information on that side, but to Major General's point, there's only certain lines there that then stops because of clearances and information that can or can't be shared. And so you kind of have this struggle with, who needs to know, and then sometimes the right people know and sometimes the wrong people know, and so on. But when it comes to, is a state alone ready to take on that responsibility, I would say any state who has tried to do that, just from my research of other states, they've struggled, if not, have not succeeded well at taking on the cyber threat, because private industry then just won't play. If you cross it with, listen, from our perspective, I feel like the state of Indiana, and I most certainly think the many people like with commissions, and I feel like our responsibility and our strength is creating that dialogue and that framework. And so when I'm able to say, I I can facilitate it from the state of Indiana's perspective. I can provide you access to the adjunct general who has information, to the executive director of Homeland Security, the state police, to the governor, to the lieutenant governor, and their priorities, so that we can align better, and also most certainly and more importantly understand the private sector's needs, right? Because I think it gets kind of dangerous when states assume what they should be doing or what we need to be doing, and that crosstalk, or a lot of times more not really crosstalk, it's one way down. And so a lot of what I've done with the council for Indiana has been, we have 20 committees. 8 of those are critical infrastructure, from energy, defense, water, wastewater, finance, healthcare, et cetera. And then the other 12 are areas that cross over every sector. So, workforce development, economic development, policy, public awareness. And those are not necessarily driven by state people. They are driven by the experts in that field who have been in that world for 1, 2, 3 decades, right? So a good example would be public awareness and training. I like to use this example because the chair of that, who also sits on the council, is the executive director of our Hoosier Press Association, so complete media, right? And the co-chair is a 40-year veteran of public relations who not only served and in military, also was a public relations or PIO for NATO, and then has also done private work. But you have these people, these components, right? Workforce development. You have our Department of Workforce Development chairing it. Our second is Department of Education. These almost contrary groups. And not all of it is state. State doesn't have to lead every committee because, frankly, the state shouldn't. Energy, the sectors are actually led by private members because they're the ones that are the subject matter experts. They know what they need, and they know what they need from the state, and they most certainly know what they don't need from the state. They're very clear on that. But I think understanding, seek to understand and figuring that out first, and really respecting those lines as a state, that I would say that's our strength, and that's how we're ready for approaching cybersecurity, is knowing where the line starts and where it ends, and then most certainly understanding the relationship value of private sector.
What about Louisiana, Colonel Donnelly?
Just to piggyback off, we're doing the same thing with the commission. We have the Louisiana has the Chemical Association, Lonnie, the Manufacturing Industry Association. We have Stevenson Disaster Management Institute. We have Cox Communication. We have the Critical Infrastructure, one of the 3 energy providers. We have CLECO at the table. And a lot of that, we're trying to, just with the security clearance issue, find a way to do integration centers within Louisiana to try to build a place where we can go and collaborate and share information. Not everything has to be in a classified setting. When you look at indicators of compromise and things that are out there with persistent threats, you want to be able to share the best business practice with somebody that's experiencing something, to share that so they can go and defend against it without that having happened to them. So a lot of that is what we're doing right now within the commission. And I think the recommendation and the best practices to implement things like the NIST framework, or to change up some of the legislation to look at gaps within federal and state law to try to increase some of our cyber laws within the state that match the federal side. So we have a couple of recommendations that we're working through the 2019 legislative planning session to do a couple of resolution studies on adapting the NIST framework, and a couple of beta tests that will allow us to look at what are the best practices that we need to share with the private sector. And a lot of the experience does come from third-party vendors and a lot of subject matter expertise that's there with some of those technology companies like CenturyTel, IBM. They just moved in a big corporation called DXC, which was a merger between Hewlett-Packard. And a lot of that, we're leveraging those tools that they have and those business practices to apply leading-edge technology, and we're taking it into research and development to be able to share that within Louisiana, so we understand when we go and meet a threat head-on that we have the tools available in our toolbox to be able to take care of the incident, contain the incident. Once you mitigate the threat, then you can restore essential services and then move back into, recovery mode and get everything back normalized. So those, identify, detect, respond, and recover is what this framework's all about, and trying to institute a national level standard for somebody that's a small business owner that don't have the resources. That's the challenge. And then trying to impose a standard on companies, and if they don't meet the standard, then so what? What are you going to do after that? Those that don't have the resources and the money. So we're going to have to provide the support to try to figure out exactly what we need to do to make sure we can mitigate and help out even the small business owners, because that's really a lot of small business owners in Louisiana don't have the resources to be able to help themselves. So we're trying to figure out exactly what we need to do to help those individuals out.
Well, and
And-
to add to that, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, and who knows which of those small businesses might be a third-party vendor to a very big business, which
Right.
could lead
Correct.
to a very big
Right.
cyber attack. So.
Well, and I would say that it's not an aspect of just, one, they have to recognize there's a problem first, right? But when it comes to the business world, incentives are like the key buzzword, but it is a powerful way. If you're incentivizing change, because that really is what we're doing, right? From a cybersecurity perspective, we're realizing it is not just an IT problem, it's a business problem. It's not just a CIO's problem, it's a executive, the CEO's problem as well. It's operationally a problem that needs to be addressed at every level. And so to kind of get that across, we have to then now start talking business talk, right? You can't talk about, well, you need to do it because if you care about the safety of, the state or Hoosiers or your, that's why you need to do it. Well, philosophically, yes, but when you're asking them to spend millions of dollars to meet, certain standards, or if they have defense, contracts and now they have to, meet FedRAMP standards, and that kind of thing that become very costly, then to your point, provide them resources, but resources they can actually understand, resources that they can actually take to their executives who also need to be convinced. So, because executives here, they're required to do things every day. It's a matter of putting it in some kind of quantitative view, whether that's as simple as a pie chart or simple as a score. Indiana and Purdue University developed a scorecard that took Department of Defense's focus areas and then narrow that down to NIST standard control areas, and then narrow that, which then at that, of course, was like a 20th grade level reading. And so not friendly for the business. And we took that further and worked those questions, and it's on our website at in.gov/cyber, and took it down to an 8th grade reading level, which we haven't seen done anywhere. Believe me, I really tried hard to copy somebody else's stuff. Being a state, we love to share, like to your point, right? Just take the playbook, right? And when people will ask me, hey, can I use your, what can I see your plan? What do you think about it? Like, oh my God, steal it, replace it with your state, change the things that are more appropriate for you. But, that's the nice thing about being a state person is that there's no real, unlike business, I think there's no real competition in that sense, because we are strong as the people around us. And so, at least that's my philosophy. So taking it down to that 8th grade level for any business person who is not a CIO to complete and get just a score. Yeah, you're red and you suck. Now you know that you have problems. How can you then turn away from trying to figure out? But don't just say they have a problem. Provide them the solutions that are also easy to implement and the resources. And there are a lot out there. I think it's just a matter of collecting them and putting them in an easy area to get to.
Meg, can I answer your question a different way? So a couple principles that I follow, and some of these come from Governor Snyder. One, cyber is a team sport. You heard that. If Governor Snyder were here, he'd tell you that cyber is something you never win. The question, to reframe it, was one aspect of the question, which we've talked on the other side, is nation-state actors. And I always assume everything can be hacked, whether it can or can't. Just assume it. It just makes planning easier, it makes response easier, it makes everything easier. Because everybody's always surprised when they think something can't be, and it is. But we have a numbers problem. And the National Security Council and our national strategies identify this, discuss it. It's numbers. If we had a near-peer competitor with we're going to get outgunned and outmanned, it's easier to attack than defend. We don't have the numbers. So one of the things that all of the states here and most of the states that we've interacted with and NGA is supporting is the talent development. That's one of the things you cannot, I'll just say it, tax and spend at the federal level to create cyber talent. It has to happen at the local state level. It has to happen with business. And so everything that we've done in Michigan with the Michigan Cyber Range, we brought in Dr. Adams, who just retired from active duty, is to the DoD Instruction 8570 standards. You've got these nationally NIST, NSA recognized certificates. There's a lot of philosophical debate between expert cyber folks and just cranking out certificates. But I'll tell you, the state of Virginia's figured it out. You know, the governor and the legislature mandates that every community college and university that's state funded shall teach those certificates. Because if you don't have those certificates, you can't get on a keyboard. We've got to have a national framework. So the Michigan Cyber Range is used in part in different brands and names and versions by, I think, a dozen states and universities, Texas A&M, George Washington, Indiana. We play in it all the time. We have permission from Cyber Command to use this virtual world Alphaville. It's all of the 8570s, SCADA, attack, defend, gaming, scoring with NATO partners. So we do exercises at the state. One of the things we haven't talked about is a state partnership for peace. Indiana is very active, Louisiana, Michigan. Michigan's partnered with Latvia, for instance. Maryland and Pennsylvania are the other two Baltic countries, so they're very attuned to cyber. And a couple times a year, Indiana is always there, and we're going to play again on the 29th up in Detroit, the International North American International Cyber Summit. We'll have 8 or 10 states and 8 or 10 countries in Alphaville playing, but everything's to those federal standards. So we've got to figure out more ways to incubate talent. Some of the high school cyber challenges are great. Michigan has its own high school cyber challenge. You've got Cyber Patriot. Those are the kind of things we need. We need just more. We don't need more people to do those things that are youth and join the military. We need just more people to be aware of these federal things, create those ecosystems, and have more talent for, God forbid, that day where we have that nation-state war in all 5 domains, and you wake up and nothing works, and how are we going to overcome that?
Oh, so you don't sleep at night either?
I do better now than I used to, yes. Yes.
Right. So we'll try to get some good news stories in, don't worry. Spearphishing unbelievably remains one of the most, if not the most, successful entry points into systems. We are human and we make mistakes. And there are some very sophisticated actors who can collect enough public information to trick us into clickbait. How are you, some of you mentioned this briefly, but how are you integrating the educational component into your efforts for your states? You mentioned demystifying. How are you thinking about that? Do you have specific programs? I mean, you mentioned kids and training and the talent issue, but how do you, how are you thinking about that?
So I would say one of the first things is realizing that we are the problem. So a lot of times, and you guys can totally steal this. So all the room except this last row, raise your hands. Yeah, I know, I'm making you guys do things, right? Okay, and so look back and forth. You are the reason why the attack occurs. When you're looking at 80% of the reason why it's to the point of phishing, right, and the social engineering component, the psychology of it, it is not an IT component that is getting in. It is the people component. We share way too much on social media, so people are like, I can't believe they knew I was on vacation, and they said it and it was very specific, and they knew who I was on vacation with, and that was what the email was from, right? Well, I mean, you also posted on Twitter that has metadata to your, the photos you have, or you literally live stream stuff. And so it becomes, it's really a psychological warfare now, right? I mean, it isn't just the ones and zeros person in a basement. It's somebody who's out there social engineering. You don't even know who's in the crowd. I don't even know who's in this crowd who could be taking information and tidbits and saying, I should probably consider that next time I try to send Shatrice an email, thinking it's, from from Major General and saying, hey, what a great conversation, here's some good information, click this link, right? So really becomes not only from the get-go from our kids, and like I feel so sorry for my 15-year-old and almost 7-year-old because they do not have fun on electronics because of me. My 15-year-old daughter is not on social media. I know, right? I'm like so unpopular. But we tried it, and then she started posting things, and I was like, all right, I need you to stop talking about her vacation. Why? People want to know, yeah, but they also know you're my kid. So that's, it becomes a general public awareness aspect of it. And you have to start at the individual level and then use those skills that transfers into the employee level, in addition to what Major General was talking about, having the actual skilled people also talking about it and talking about it in normal people speak, right, is really how we have to demystify it.
So I can, in my day job, I'm an assistant adjutant general, a state employee. Governor Snyder, the Department of Technology Managed Budget, we've put out to bid and have a cyber training program, like 3 to 5 minute courses. If you're in the Department of Defense, you get your cybersecurity awareness training every year. It's the same sort of stuff. However, they track it by department. If you're an appointee, which includes the adjutant general, assistant adjutant generals, every cabinet meeting, the governor has the list of who's done the courses and who hasn't. if you're on his cabinet, and then the Department of Technology Managed Budget will do spear phishing by department and measure it, and and so you'll actually get a report saying, oh, the last month we initiated 100 spear phishing attacks against the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, and you'll get actually a score, a number, and they measure it and how well your department's doing and actually learning the material, and the director gets that feedback. So that's pretty effective, but it starts, you said it earlier, it's about command emphasis, it starts at the top.
Your point. Anything in Louisiana?
No, just to add to what General Stone was talking about, we all do the awareness training. I know state employees have to do it, but even on the DoD side, we have specific things we have to do every year to include new employees. But one of the things that Governor Edwards did this year was the proclamation for Cybersecurity Awareness Month. We set up the Commission's website, which has got a lot of tools on awareness training, and a lot of the people are taking advantage of those things that are easy to access. Like for us, it requires a CAC card to get on our system to get to the DoD version of the awareness training, but then put it in a perspective where you can simplify it to the lowest level and make it fun and animated. And I think, we're trying to create a model that we can use in the state to share with the public and private sector to make sure that everybody's, taking advantage of some easy tools to try to take advantage to protect your personal information and what you can do online to be safe and then not be victim of spear phishing or other. So,
and to add to those things, I think here's the other thing that we struggle with, right? From the state perspective, to your point, effective when your boss is like, hey, and I've been totally that person because I'm busy and I'm like, I got to get to that. And they're like, hey, you haven't done it and the deadline's tomorrow. And I was like, oh, I know. And I'm the cybersecurity director for the state of Indiana. So I'm kind of like, I really need to not be on the bad list when that comes out. But that's from a state perspective, right? How do you do it at a business perspective, a small business perspective? One of the things, and I commend the utility that we had some closed briefings, and a utility talked about how they handle phishing campaigns, right? And it is not just a list. We are humans, and when we talk about Maslow hierarchy of needs, at the bottom side of it, survival component, right? We need a job, we need to get paid, so that we can, buy food and have shelter. So the way they approach it is, if you pass the phishing and you take the training and you pass it, after every quarter you get a bonus, which is yay. But on the flip side of that, if you don't, if you click on the link, then you need to take more training. If you click on it again, then you need to do in-person training. If you click on it again, you get written up. If you click on it again, you're fired. And when people talk about, wow, that's really, really drastic, but the person of this utility CEO who was very, very, and I would totally do it too once I'm sure one day I will click on something. I will totally admit it. She's like, yep, I totally felt it and had to once and, and had to do it. And I had to be really careful because you really have to pay attention. Again, top down, right? But it isn't harsh because what their perspective is they are the keys and the endpoints to our critical infrastructure. If the energy goes out because somebody didn't, somebody clicked and they didn't take note the importance that they have and the responsibility they have working for our critical infrastructure, then they can't work for us, which is like, oh yeah, that's kind of brilliant. But you have to be on the other side of things. We're humans, right? So, carrot stick kind of thing. So give us the carrot too. I mean, I liked the bone. I was like, that also perks people's ears. I mean, everybody likes a little extra money, but also know that there's true consequences. And I think a lot of people struggle with the consequences of making it serious because as employees who has nothing to do with IT, you're like, oh my gosh, phishing. And I say that because I also say that too, because I'm like, how many more of these do I take, right? But it's so sophisticated, you have to stay on top of it and you have to make it fun. But I think you have to figure out what works for that group, I think that there's a transportation place that had a wall of shame. So, I mean, for that group, that worked, right? So they put it in their break room. If they clicked, they got their name on the wall of shame. That doesn't work for every industry. But I think knowing your audience and knowing what really matters and how it gets to them is really the way that as leaders, we have to kind of start thinking creatively about.
General Stone, you mentioned this briefly, the cyber range facilities, the interstate network that you are setting up or in the process of setting up. Tell us about that and how does that differ from, there are multi-state information and analysis centers that share threat information. How does that differ and why is this important?
Okay, so let's talk about the multi-state, the ISACs. The ISACs is really the states getting together, best practices. They have a problem, there's a new virus, sharing it, the CIOs, getting state police dissemination. The Michigan Cyber Range, when we created it, we did a national search of programs, and there are many things called cyber ranges.
I know, yes,
Yes.
cyber range
And
is a big
so
word.
what's the definition of a cyber range? But what we decided to do, we were fortunate because in our state, we've got the Merit Network, which Michigan Educational Research Network. It's the oldest, largest fiber optic network in the world. It's 4,000 miles, stretches into every state in FEMA Region 5. Supports in Michigan, it's a nonprofit. It's connected to every high school, community college, and university in Michigan. Hubbed and headquartered at Ann Arbor. So the governor said, we did our SWOT analysis on cyber, and the White House had for years been trying to get a national network of cybersecurity ranges to train workforce, unclassified. So we actually met with Howard Schmidt at the White House back in the day, and we're looking at all the money that they had spent on their original intent, and they wanted a coast-to-coast network of ranges that could train workforce and federal standards. So we actually took Dr. Adams, we recruited him off active duty. Dr. Don Welch was a former active duty colonel, PhD, was the president of Merit. And we followed the service academies have a cyber competition, and DARPA helped create that. So we followed that same model. And then the utility companies invested, DHS made a small investment, and everything is built in the SCADA world. Now, in the Michigan Cyber Range, there's a couple principles in our strategy. One is we didn't want it to be just about Michigan. Of course, we wanted the Michigan brand on it, which we did. But we intended it to be multi-state, across state lines. We intended it to be a national. So when we opened the Michigan Cyber Range, we actually had West Point cadets, cyber cadets, attacking Alphaville. You have to actually break into the library to get the keys, to get into City Hall, to get into the SCADA, to actually attack it. And then we actually had the California Air National Guard help defend. We wanted to show that we could do it coast to coast. That total investment was less than $1 million. What the White House had done previously with Congress was had funded $110 million to the National Science Foundation to do a similar project They partnered with DARPA, and they created the National Cyber Range, which is a great asset for our country, but it's classified and never met the original intent from the White House. So what we've done since then is we've decided to add industries and clusters. So, we are always looking, one of the the three missions of the National Guard is we fight and win our nation's wars, we defend the homeland, and we build partnerships. We're really good at finding partnerships and other people's money and everybody chipping in. But, it's all really about education and educating clusters for workforce. But we use it, for instance, when we recruit a new cyber warrior in the Air Army National Guard. I've got a little bit of state tuition money. We use the nonprofit. They go get their, cybersecurity certificates, Security Plus, CISPs, things along those lines, and help them with their military readiness and help them become citizen soldiers and airmen. We're not trying to make them full-time employees, and we're trying to get them plugged in at utility companies and get them plugged in at State Department of Technology Management Budget. So we've created this whole gamification, and we use it for the high school cyber challenge for the governor. But our vision is this to be nationally. George Washington University uses it. Texas A&M, we're with Dr. Ragsdale in partnership. We see a family of ranges all under these federal standards, all working together to create workforce and clusters. And we've now got we're now at the point where we can do delivery content of those cybersecurity certificates into rural communities. So we've got high schools in rural areas we're testing where they don't have to hire an instructor. And so they can actually do Security Plus in a high school as part of a course, and things along those lines. So we're experimenting with the Department of Education on the content delivery, how to simplify it, flatten it, make it cost-effective or almost zero cost for public education, and that build into those career paths.
Yeah. And the gamification component is important, right?
Yes.
I think that's it's no longer go get a really fat book and take a test and therefore you are a cyber warrior. You really do have to kind of get in and figure out, it is consistently on the workforce development side from young to underemployed to the various aspects of those that we want to employ. It really does become a critical thinking type of game. You can have that back knowledge, but if you can't do it, the critical thinking and with pressure and be creative, it's not.
And you have to work in teams.
Yeah.
And we're learning that the test scores, we send our young Army cyber warriors to Fort Gordon. The same courses are taught in 2 weeks at Fort Gordon. We can do them in 5 days, and our pass rates are higher. Because it's team and it's done together. Now, I do have to brag about Indiana a little bit because Indiana's made investments. General Carr, Muscatatuck. No, I know. We're friendly competitors. But they've done a different type of cyber range, and we've sent Dr. Adams down there. We collaborate. Their product is mostly for Homeland Security and older SCADA and Department of Energy. Theirs are less driven towards the individual training of the certificates, where ours are driven more for the training for the clusters, the industry, and the certificates, where theirs is more of the interactive cyber effects and domestic operations and, dirty bomb going off or something and then having a cyber attack.
Muscatatuck is an amazing gym that Indiana doesn't, people don't know. When you hear cyber range, right? Big word, right?
Yes.
You think, okay, so it's a bunch of people looking at screens and they're like in separate rooms and, it's kind of like back to the local administrative network, like LAN parties that we used to have in that was literally my first date. In high school, I went to a LAN party. So I know, who knew 20 some years later I would be doing this. So you have like a team in one room, a team in another room, maybe a purple team in the middle, that kind of thing, right? And Indiana's Muscatatuck range, it is, you actually have, it was this really, back in the day where they had the health hospitals for, the mentally challenged and the undesirables of the community all got put away in this in the middle of nowhere place until that was a problem and became outlawed. So they shut down and you had this city that kind of became a ghost town, and it's really creepy too. So it is, right? Yeah. You kind of you're like, oh, I feel like bad juju's on here. So what we did is the National Guard bought it. It's a actual town. They have a wastewater facility. They have a hospital. They're building a bank. They have tunnels. They have transportation, and you literally can go there and attack and see the effects of it on an operations side of it. So you don't have just the IT people figuring out the kind of the gamification component of it, but what we had was through one of our exercises called CritX, is we had actually the operations people doing their normal job, they actually clicked on a weather link that had a package on there that was all like something that freaked everybody out. Every VIP was like, oh my God, that's all they had to do? And all of that was free. So that's always good education to do that. And the operations people are like, hey, something's not right. How do we react to that? It goes on both sides.
Yeah, so the good thing about Muscatatuck, and we're doing something different, but it's sharing, collaborating, and understanding that you can have national networks of cyber agents with all different core competencies.
Right.
They're not designed to be the same. In their situation, what's really great about it is you go down there for domestic operations training, and my unit does frequently, is a lot of people don't understand cyber effects, and so they can shut the lights off during the exercise and understand that that was a cyber attack. What we've done in Alphaville is created Griffinville at Camp Grayling. Camp Grayling, Michigan is the 7th largest Army installation in the world. And we have a CACTIF, a combined arms training little city, but it's much more modern than the Muscatatuck version, but it's much smaller and much more modest, and it's not as disruptive, I would call it, as Muscatatuck. But in our gamification, we actually worked with West Point in some of the white papers coming out before the Army Cyber Institute stood up there, where in our Alphaville, Griffinville, you can actually now shut off the lights, have cyber effects. We're adding some of the water effects up there. We're working with TARDEC, Tank Automotive Research Development Engineering Center, the U.S. Army, looking at adding some vehicle-to-grid capabilities for cyber to be able to look at those effects, the Internet of Things, and connecting infrastructure. And actually, next version will be having a training event, maybe an infantry company or battalions defending a city while you're doing a cyber exercise remotely, and when the red team knocks out the power grid, the lights go off. Or what we want to do is have that company commander figure out when the water goes down, how is he going to change his logistics plan to support an entire city with water during a military exercise. I mean, that's where you start having that military awakening that this is going to affect me on a battlefield. This is going to affect me in a city, and the complex, the guard response to the humanitarian side of it.
Yeah. Well, and to your point, right, it's all about how do we work with our partners to be able to respond to it and get to a recovery aspect of it, right? And it's the cascading effects I think people don't realize is really actually the response and the recovery component of it. It isn't just we've got to go and get that data information and fix it, but when it becomes an operations issue, I think Louisiana has done some really good stuff when it comes to like your disruption plan or your response plan of how do we then pull everybody together. They still have to go do the response, right? I mean, I think that's kind of what you guys have been working on.
Yeah, and we're working with, like I said, the Cyber Range at LSU, which we create a persistent cyber threat environment. And, within the SCADA environment, within the range, they actually got a realistic virtual training site or actual industrial chemical plant that they set up that has industrial control systems. And once you break into it and hack into it, like if you want to change the temperature settings on certain gauges, it actually catches fire and shows you what the effects are and how you have to respond. And that is not just a sense of responding from a cyber. Then all of a sudden you got the fire and rescue guys going in to put the fire out and contain the situation. At the same time, you're dealing with a network issue and the cyber threat. So there's so many different components in this that are affected. Once you see the effect of what the threat is on a network that has the problem where you shut down the electric grid, okay, what are you going to do when thousands of people are without power? So you have to run through those steps to restore power and restore the network. And it takes the energy providers that are going out to reestablish the electric grid. At the same time, you're trying to bring the network back up. So it's a lot of things working in concert with each other. It's not just the network component. It's the effects of, what happens when you shut that network down.
So one quick point for the audience, because I see some uniform people here. On the Griffinville, Alphaville, not a single Department of Air Force or Army dollar went into those. The investment of the Michigan Cyber Range, that DHS invested $50,000 about 7 years ago. That's the only federal investment. I think Indiana has done everything through either the state of Indiana or partnerships with DOE. and or specific programs. But again, that goes back to the strength of partnerships. I think Louisiana, the LSU relationship, but correct me if I'm wrong, Ken, you guys may have gotten a federal grant, but it was specifically you competed for it, and then
Yes, sir.
and so this is not stuff where we're going to the DoD. What the point is, we're not going to the DoD budget and pulling money down to do these experiments in cyber. We're doing them because they're the right things to do, and the states are making commitments. We're local partners.
Although we would not say no.
Yes.
Right, let's just make that clear too.
Yes, make
I
sure,
mean, if people want to give us money,
Yeah.
love that.
Right.
Yeah.
General Stone and Colonel Donnelly, you were both deployed to Iraq, and I believe are both MPs. And Colonel Donnelly, you were in Haiti. Are there lessons that you learned operationally that you've brought back to the states? I'm sure you integrated technology in ways you probably can't discuss while out on the battlefield. But how does that connect back to what you do on a daily basis?
Well, yeah, in Haiti, I mean, it was more of a humanitarian relief effort after the earthquake. We went down there to basically build schools and do some medical readiness exercise to provide basic care to some of the affected citizens in Haiti and help them rebuild some of their schools and their medical clinics. But a lot of the components, they're really on a technology side of it. We didn't have a lot of play with the with that part of it. But you know, when I came back from Haiti, I had a new perspective on some of the physical response that you have to do all the things to respond to a natural disaster or to do a humanitarian relief effort where you got to bring a lot of resources into a country. That's the biggest takeaway that we had there. And I know the state partnership program that we have is with Haiti, and we also have one with Belize. We haven't done a lot of specific things within the computing part and the network part with our partnerships. I don't know if General Stone can speak to the partnerships that Michigan has, but we're still trying to work through those things to do some of the coordination with Haiti and Belize to try to bring the cyber aspect element into those countries.
So I'll answer that, and I'll go back to your question. So Mr. Guy Walsh at U.S. Cyber Command is a retired Maryland Air Guardsman. Is an SES. We work and talk almost weekly. There is a deliberate, both the Chief of the National Guard Bureau has his cyber strategy we've talked about before, you're very well aware of, and Cyber Command has its strategy, which is synced to the new National Cybersecurity Strategy, which was just published last month. I think it's right near the end. You'll see the international outreach. So there is an intent for there to be outreach. It's being organized. There is a deliberate intent by the national security staff that to use the National Guard State Partnership for Peace, and we're kind of working through the unclassified piece and what products can be used in what environment. So I think we've got all the framework established for the National Guard Bureau staff to Cyber Command to get those authorities. And the Michigan Cyber Range is one of many unclassified tools that they envision being able to do or have these family of ranges in the outreach. Of course, there's some countries we can't work with so closely. But Meg, to go back to your question, I got to be a little bit careful. I had my cyber awakening was Iraq 2007, 2008 during the surge. So as a military police officer, I was the senior MP in my military police brigade as the deputy, but my commander, a general, was not an MP. I had to report directly to General Petraeus on all detention operations. It was the surge. We had 25,000 detainees. We had a lot of special detention. You know, any of you that were watching the news back then, I was surprised when I got in the theater that I had a Navy corpsman or Navy officer assigned to me, an electronic warfare officer. I'm like, you know, I had to sign off on all the electronic warfare for my task force on a monthly basis, and got read in. It was very eye-opening to me. I can't describe what was eye-opening. I can tell you our competitors, and not just, you know, tribal leadership and Al-Qaeda, were watching and experimenting, and from a distance. It was the international aspect of IT cyber and its effects, for me, was very eye-opening. I came home Really, I think that's why I've been doing this and so passionate about it so long, was just those experiences, seeing senior leaders nearly get relieved. You got to remember, too, go back in history, that was when we had thumb drives. And in the middle of the deployment, we had a big hack, and we couldn't use thumb drives. Imagine working on classified systems on a daily basis, moving your orders from a 3- and 4-star headquarters back and forth, and you're all of a sudden told and not told why you can't move your data that way, and you don't have CD-ROM drives and the ability to store and move data around in large volumes in the middle of a war effort for a 3- and a 4-star general. And then we had a security breach with an infantry battalion who came on a pre-deployment site survey, and we actually shut the entire battalion down in Kuwait, and they couldn't move for 4 weeks until the security investigation was over. 4 weeks. So we had to tell another unit they had to stay on mission in Iraq in combat for an extra month because of a security violation with security. So those are the kind of things that, that don't always, I can talk about generally speaking, but the security aspect in conflict and the international aspect of cyber that was over a decade ago. And so I can't even imagine
What it's like today.
what it's like today.
Yes. Well, thank you. Last question for me, and then we'll open it up to the audience. You had mentioned this, General Stone, that the title matters, especially in the state and especially in the functions that you all serve. And the Department of Homeland Security has learned that, and that they've actually requested that the National Programs and Protections Directorate, under which cyber sits, be actually called Cybersecurity, so people know who to call. Tell us why that matters and how you all have worked around it, and what do we need to do to help you going forward?
So maybe I can turn over to Ken. But when you go to U.S. Northern Command to take the Joint Task Force Commanders course or the Dual Status Commanders course, where many senior guardsmen are trained in each state to command both federal and National Guard forces under federal law. In that framework, one of the first blocks of instruction is all disasters are local. They all start local, they're all political, and they all end local. And so if you have the national response framework, I'm going to turn over to Ken in a second because he's from Louisiana. My boss deployed his whole Guard division to Katrina and led Task Force Mississippi down there with 25,000 soldiers, airmen, and Marines. But it starts with the locals starting the event and ending the event, and it's political. So yeah, there's a federal response at some point, but the federal mission is to get in, give the help that's needed, not waste federal assets, the economy law, and get out and turn over control back to the state. So Ken, I think with all your hurricane experience and what you guys do, can you build on that maybe?
No, really. I know that we talked about at the state level we have the emergency support functions, and for a natural disaster, we set up at the local level, they set up an incident command post, and most of the support requirements, once the local resources are exhausted, they're going to ask for state support. So we collect all of those requests in what's called Web EOC, and the local officials at the Emergency Operations Center put in all of their requests through Web EOC, and then we start vetting those requests on what department those need to come out of, whether it's basic life support type stuff, or they need generators or whatever the case may be. Then once we deplete all of the state assets, then we start looking at what federal resources are already staged, what FEMA has already pre-positioned and staged assets within the state. A lot of it that we turn into is our commodity distribution, where we're actually pumping out commodities to the affected areas where they don't have any life support at all. So, once we get to that point in the federal request are in, then it's a coordination of efforts of even going state to state with our EMAC request between what states have, other National Guard states have to bring to the fight. So once we mobilize 100% of the Louisiana National Guard and we need more assets, we start looking at all our state EMAC requests where we have prearranged resources out of other states that aren't affected by the hurricane that come and contribute. just like Hurricane Katrina. And then you look at the federal side where you have your Northcom partner sitting right next to you in a joint task force command setting where you have a dual status command. And most of the time our JTF commander is our chief of staff. And he's actually working both in the dual status of both Title 10 and Title 32 status. So he just flips his hat back and forth depending upon what authority level he has to transition to, and leans to the Northcom guy and says, we need this amount of support on the federal side. But, everything that's taken place at that time is all synchronized. I mean, there's reception and integration locations throughout the state where people lost control of different assets coming into the state because everybody really wanted to contribute help. So that's really more in the RSOI phase where you're actually accounting for every single person that's coming in on either on a unit side or the guard side or resources to make sure that those resources get to the right place and not end up, to where you have too much support in one place and not enough support in another place. So that's the common, theme for, what we're doing on a response plan. And it mimics the National Incidents Management System, on a federal side. So the NIMS and the WebEOC all line up together. And that's pretty much how we work it in Louisiana.
Yeah, Indiana is almost exactly the same. Okay. I think the challenge that we have with cybersecurity is it isn't the same as, an F5 tornado where we can, as the public and even as emergency responders, see the damage that's been done, right? Or there's an endpoint or there's a start point and an end point to it. I think that the scary aspect and why cybersecurity is not just, hot right now, but it really is the serious next thing that is not going to go away is because as one entity is being attacked at a local level, another one is being attacked over here, another one over here, another one over there, which is to your earlier point why this information sharing component, while it's tricky and it's still very difficult, especially with private sector, a lot of times when I've talked to people and they're like, listen, we don't know who to call with the state of Indiana at first, and now they have a better idea. And unfortunately, it's probably me most of the time. But before, I would talk to our leadership of the state, and they're like, well, they just need to tell us. They need to tell us when they're hacked. And I'm like, I would tell them not to tell us because if I was their advisor to a CEO and I don't know where that information is going from a PR perspective, a stockholder perspective, I mean, again, business world, right? Why would I then just go and just leave myself laying out there and not know what they can do for me? Who is it going to go to? How classified is it going to stay? And that kind of thing. So that information sharing trust is a key thing to figuring out.
So Tracy brought up a good point, fusion centers. Mm-hmm. So we talked about the ISAC, but I know Indiana's done this in their own way. Michigan's done it with the Michigan Cyber Command Center, which is mostly civilians working for state police. But you can have these individual attacks, and you've got to see the patterns. Mm-hmm. Kansas has created a fusion center specifically for cyber with its interagency, federal and state with utility companies, where they're actually looking at all the cyber attacks and trying to find those patterns and reporting it up to the feds. Mm-hmm. Because there's not enough people at the federal level looking for those patterns. I mean, you can have an individual incident reported, but you might not see that there were 3 hospitals that all got hit in an area. So a lot of the collective talk fusion work is actually happening at the state level, where they're seeing the patterns or putting up the messaging and then reporting up to the Fed.
Yeah, and I think the key to that is, one of the things that we're doing with within the LA Safe, which is our state fusion center, is that most of the information that's being reported in that, like I said, there's a lot of cyber things that are going on that they don't know about, probably for the same reasons that you talked about. But all of that is pretty much in a manual mode, in an analog mode. We're trying to automate the system now. That seems to be the biggest challenge for people to be able to report in within an automated system. Right now, it's mostly just phone calls or email that are coming in. But that's really where the fusion center is where the decisions are being made of whether or not that reaches the level of support required to send in support maybe from the National Guard or one of the other cyber assets that we have within Louisiana to go out and work to try to fix whatever their problem is or offer up assistance. So the whole trust thing, and that's the message we're trying to get out, is to build these information sharing analysis in organizations and create incentives within the state so that more people will be able to participate on a volunteer basis and to be able to gain an incentive from it to make more people want to, most people do want to come in and give us information, but the big thing is they don't want to have anybody expose their trade secrets or their proprietary information to do damage to their organization, their company moving forward, to the economic impacts to the people that are, looking to do the same sort of business or looking to capitalize on their, problem to take advantage of that company, because they're trying to do the same thing. So not everybody's willing to share, and I think that's really where the, the crux of the problem lies, is in information sharing.
And
moving forward.
Yeah, you're right. The CIOs, every CIO I talk to, they're like, "Oh no, I really want to share the information, but then I talk to my lawyer, and then I can't." Or I talk to my PR people, and then they're like, "No, you can't go tell other people." And it's even gotten to the point with some sectors, like our healthcare sector, for example, where as the director and in the state, we like to say, "Tell us," so that we can also tell feds and stuff like that. But actually, we're creating a cyber sharing maturity model. With seven levels, or I like to say 7 layers because it makes me think of dip. But it isn't. I think people want to share, but they don't know how to share. It's almost oversaturation sometimes when it comes to the ISACs and the different types of ISACs and the federal partners and the state partners, and then you have CIO groups, and then you have your own healthcare groups. And from my perspective, when I talk to people, I'm like, I just want you to share. If that means you're not telling us as a state, but you're at least telling your fellow CIOs in the healthcare industry, and you guys create this tight-knit, MOU, you're not going to, confidential, and you're not going to share with anyone else until it reaches a level of health and safety where you really do need to be bringing on extra resources, again, that local to state kind of thing, then do that. That's fine. It's better than what it is now, which is we don't know where to go, how to share effectively, and so, just to provide even basic guidance to the most mature level, which is most certainly the automation level. So like, hey, you don't have to actually personally share and even tell your lawyer. Just connect and we'll know anyway.
But you just brought up another point. Another reason why it's so vital that states share is look at federal FOIA law. You've got, everybody knows what FOIA is, but every state's got a different FOIA law.
They do.
So with cybersecurity, we have all kinds of complex issues, and we have to share statutes as this market evolves, as this situation evolves. Michigan, we did not succeed in mimicking the federal FOIA law exemptions for cyber that we thought we would get the legislature the first time. It was a hard sell, and it had to go back to a second term to get it through, because if you share with state police, well, a competitor can FOIA it, and guess what? Under state FOIA, you can get that information.
Yes.
Under federal FOIA, you couldn't, because there's federal exemptions for this. So the policy collaboration, as this evolves, the threats evolve, have to continue. It has to continue at the state level, it has to continue at the federal level, and we've all got to keep talking policy back and forth as this evolves and try to stay in sync.
Yeah, and the only thing I'll add to what the general's talking about, the state attorney generals, have to get involved. I mean, they're part of our Cybersecurity Commission, and the other thing is we're really pushing to get MOAs and MOUs in place as well as non-disclosure agreements. That's really going to be the key moving forward to trust.
Yeah, absolutely. I had every council member do an NDA. As soon as they're like, you're interested, okay, and do kind of a vetting and stuff, because it is cyber. We can't just have anybody and everyone at the table. They have to have the expertise, and there has to be an element of trust from that perspective. Is it going to be perfect? No, but I think the due diligence has to happen first. So.
And then the last thing is on the clearance issue. Not everybody that's sitting at the table within the commission from the private sector have the same level of clearances. Even the state police, only has a secret level clearance. So, we have top secret clearances. So to try to figure out, okay, how do we get the private sector clearances enough to be able to share information without having just to say everything has to be an unclassified or FOUO level. But that's another significant challenge, because you really can just share basic information. You can't go into details. You can't share sources and methods and all of those other things, but you can share indicators of compromise, things that they can go back and look at specific IP addresses and, to tackle a problem. But I think that's going to be key is the security clearance aspect of it as well.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So let's open it up to the audience. Questions, please. And we have a microphone. How about this one right here? And please introduce yourself.
Certainly. I'm Marina Fazal, an Afghan-American journalist. I recently attended another event where the issue of quantum computing was brought up and how the first quantum computer is estimated to perhaps be operational as soon as 6 years to 10 years out, and when that happens, that will disrupt many aspects of our modern lives, banking, all sorts of bureaucracies, government, warfare, etc. If you could please comment on that front, one of the issues that was brought up in that event was the time it will take large bureaucracies to prepare to switch from regular computing to quantum computing. Is there anything that's being done on that front here in the United States? The other is, when I hear all of your comment as a human being, I can't help but to think, what a marvelous world we're living in, where we have the situation with the hurricanes, we have climate change, and we have wars continuing. And it's obviously perhaps unrealistic to imagine that human nature will change, and yet it seems that we are spending a lot of resources now to prepare for man-made disasters of the future in the cyber age. Is democracy sufficient enough of a system of governance anymore? Because how can rivalries be managed in the future in the sphere? Don't we need a unified system of governance? Thank you.
Well, I'll start with democracy. I think democracy is alive and well. I think, there's a lot of national division politically today. But, I had the pleasure of listening to General Milley, Chief of Staff of the Army, recently quite a bit. Spent quite a bit of time with him, with the adjutants general, assistant adjutant generals. And, we've got a lot of democratic countries, but here in the United States, you've got just over 1 million people just in the Army alone who've sworn an oath to a constitution, to an idea of freedoms, not to a king, not to a god, not to, some other system. But we've got a lot of great partners, and we do have differences with some of our near-peer competitors, but I think they can all be worked through. I pray that we don't see global conflict like we saw twice in the last 100 years. And we do have a lot of conflict today, but I think it's moving away from the nation-state actor. Now, I will say this, I'll go back to your first question, and I'll turn it over to the others. I did participate with an Army's Futures Working Group in the Pentagon a couple of years ago, and we brought in futurists, and we talked about quantum computing. I'm of the opinion, personal opinion, not my state's opinion, from listening to those experts, that artificial intelligence is in its infancy. I mean, we say we have AI. That's just a marketing thing, in my opinion, based upon the experts that I've listened to. It is a game changer. It's going to be very disruptive. I do believe we're going to cycle out of ones and zeros and go into a different type of system. So I think a lot of the software, the patches, and how we do things. But I think also when we leap to that quantum computing, there's a global threat piece to that, as you're alluding to. I think absolutely, and I think the United States, Russia, China are all watching that carefully. But I also have a belief that everything that is being collected can be used for good, and it is going to challenge us. I'm really looking forward to buying Stephen Hawking's book. I saw some of his comments and thoughts about the future and these ethical concerns, and I think that's something I'm going to absorb that over the next couple of weeks, and I think a lot of people who are concerned about this topic should absorb his thoughts on that, and we should have more debate on it and more discussion and more awareness about that.
Basically, what the general said, that's basically my depth of knowledge in quantum computing, so I'm not going to even try to go there.
I think when it comes to just any type of advanced technology, right? I mean, like 10 years ago, we didn't have iPhones, right? You know, I mean, just the computing power that we have in our hands now versus, 15 years ago is amazing, and most certainly has the benefits of it that we definitely don't want to give up, but then comes with risks. And as we're doing all that we're doing right now, right? And to your point earlier, it's never going to be a zero thing. To my point earlier, my job is not as a state director getting it down to zero, because it's never going to be zero, right? It's always going to have, we're humans, we're going to have that factoring aspect of it. We just have to make sure to set up policies, have those discussions, and make sure that we as a population, as a country, are having those conversations and making sure that we are driving the technology and how it's being used versus the technology driving us. And I think that is kind of going to be that like philosophical debate when it comes to, frankly, it'll be quantum computing right now, AI now, and 10, 15 years, it'll be a word we've also never heard of. And that's just the nature of that technological beast component of it. Most certainly on an international aspect of it, when they talk about we're already in a cyber war, or that is going to be the next thing. I still think there's still a human component of that. There's still psychology of how wars are done and so there's still playbooks that we have that we're not starting from zero, in other words. I think we learn and we base that and we most certainly share that information, and then we continue doing that, and it's just an evolving type of thing.
I think that's a perfect answer, and I do think that projection is a bit aggressive on quantum computing. There are a lot of factors why it won't become so widespread so quickly, but it is a promising technology. Other questions? Yes, down here.
Thanks, guys, and thank you all for being here this morning. I have kind of a philosophical question, if you don't mind.
I do not.
Cool.
And could you introduce yourself?
So I'm a student in the Naval War College right now.
Okay.
And something that we talk a lot about, in our seminars is whether war has to have a kinetic component. And this question comes up a lot when we talk about cyber infiltrations or exfiltrations of data or DDoS attacks and things like that. And as experts in the field, sort of on the front lines, if you want, I was just wondering if I could have your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Well, first of all, hopefully you've read Ghost Fleet, and it's very eye-opening. I encourage all our younger officers to read that book. It's fictional, but everything in there, the technology exists today. We used to joke, I think when in the early days of cyber, a half a dozen, 8 years ago, that we kind of wondered post-Iraq, Afghanistan, we're proud to serve in uniform. We wear America's cloth. We shed blood. We've buried our brothers and sisters. And America is grateful for that today, and we're really appreciative of that. However, it's getting easier and easier we haven't had really the entire nation. General Milley will also say that armies don't go to war, nations go to war. And I heard it's some cyber event, somebody say, when everybody wakes up and their Facebook doesn't work, we'll have this big national American outcry. So it's kind of an exaggeration of your point.
Are we still mad at Facebook?
Yeah, well, yeah, but the point is, I think today with these non-state actors, we're challenging the whole Western system and the definition of warfare, which is probably going to the Naval War College. And yeah, I do think that you can have economic war. You probably can bring a country to its knees without sending ships and planes. We may see something like what you're describing or asking about in the not too distant future, and maybe you don't need to send a million soldiers to the Korean Peninsula, but really it's about effects. But I do believe when it comes, I do think that we need to keep our nation's states and the UN in unity and together in coalitions and security councils to make sure that people behave within the norms of morality and humanity. So I pray those systems stay together for the next 1,000 years. But there are a lot of cyber effects that can occur that amount to warfare, and without launching entire militaries.
You don't have to answer the question.
I think the definition of what kinetic effects is, to your point, is what's going to be that philosophical component of what is war and what isn't, right? Like we were talking about the response and the kind of how the emergency operations of states and how they apply that to cybersecurity. It really does become what are the cascading effects? What's being taken away from the regular person that's starting to cause outcry or starting to cause, and that's kind of to your very first elections, right? Because I think before this role, or I've even asked people, are like, but it's it's a vote, so like why do we really care in that sense, and then people get into their own philosophical things of what a vote is, right? But it becomes a sense of anxiety within a country, and I think that's the psychological aspect of it, right? And so is that the kinetic aspect, right? If you're starting to make people question the democracy that we hold so tightly and is our base and foundation of the country, then does that then become that kinetic effect of it? I mean, I think when it happened when France, there was riots, right? I mean, so I think it is a matter of affecting the human behavior as well as our everyday lives that will become what was considered kinetic. I don't think right now people really have a sense until it happens, and then it'll be like yeah, that's what it is. From that perspective, I think it's going to be hard to define where that line is until we feel it. So,
Next question. Yep, right here.
Hi, I'm a student at Loyola, Maryland, and my question had to do, especially a point Colonel Donnelly made. So you mentioned how hackers capitalized on Hurricane Katrina, for instance. They saw Louisiana was in a weak time, and they tried to capitalize by attacking Louisiana. So do you see, and maybe the rest of the panel see, that the environment and cyber defense go hand in hand? Because if these hackers are capitalizing on hurricanes, then does that also mean that these cyber defense also comes with protecting the environment?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. I think, I know what Florida's, going through. I know that right now, the infrastructure is pretty much torn apart in Mexico Beach, Florida. So right now with the power down, I'm assuming, most of the internet is down. So I don't see that as a threat in the foreseeable future for them, even there as they try to restore power. But it could complicate matters where you're looking at lines of communication to get critical resources, and then you don't have ability to use a phone or use a computer, the network doesn't work, and all of a sudden you still have to deal with a cybersecurity incident because they're not letting you get your network up to be able to provide resources to get the community stood back up. So I do see these two things being an impact to both natural disasters, and cyber criminals are going to take advantage at your weakest moment, and you're going to continue to be faced with those challenges as they start, just like looting. When you go into a situation where you don't have any security, people are going to go in and take things that don't belong to them, and you have the same kind of effect with cybersecurity. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add.
that's a good question, though.
Yes, in the back right there.
Hey, thanks for coming today and giving us the talk. So I work with a lot of technical recruiters and small businesses and stuff, and I read a lot of articles about how there's a shortage of people to fulfill cybersecurity positions. And one of the things that I find is that I get a lot of influx of former military guys, and they're like, oh, I just got a cybersecurity degree and I'm trying to go in the workforce, or even I got a couple pipelines coming out of colleges where college students want to enter the workforce as a cybersecurity person, but they either don't have a clearance or they don't have any kind of professional experience. So a lot of the entry-level jobs will be like 3 to 5 years. Do you have any recommendations for talking to organizations or helping organizations understand that, there's just going to be a technical gap for a while these people catch up and get experience? How do you push those people into positions at state level, federal level, and even into professional organizations to help them, get through that first period where they don't have the professional experience, but there's definitely, they have the educational knowledge and they have the passion, but there's this kind of technical gap. Thank you.
So Michigan's done a really good job with this. You want to go first? You want to go first?
You can go, well, I can take it from every angle.
Yeah, I know, right? How do we start that?
Yeah, no, you've got to forgive me, but I'm a former corporate general counsel. I was HR director for a small group of companies twice, because our HR directors were relieved. So I've got it from both angles. And then in Michigan, 8 years ago, we had the highest unemployment rate in the country. We had the highest veterans unemployment rate in the country. And under Governor Snyder, I helped create the Veterans Affairs Agency and the Veterans Employment Initiatives in Michigan. So on cyber and IT, number one, there's a lot of talent out there, and there's a lot of inexperienced HR directors that don't know how to find that talent in their resumes. The resume system doesn't work very well, and there's a lot of immature or lack of understanding. Second, there are tools, and the federal government's done a good job at times and bad job at others. I'll just shout it out. We used to have this software program called H2H, Heroes to Hired, that OSD used to support, and would do all the translation for you on the resume. So there were literally hundreds of thousands of uniformed people who could go in, put in their skill sets, and it would translate it in plain English. Now, there's lots of different programs that do that, but you got to route those veterans or their service members to a professional or a service or to an entity, workforce entity, that will help them with that translation. But you're looking at experience in state government and federal government. I'll give you an example. We did the Michigan Merit Network got a federal grant with community college. Took 18 veterans and compressed 5 federal certificates, cybersecurity certificates, and NSA certificates into a 12-week course. Compressed it all the Michigan cyber range. Everybody who passed that didn't have a felony background, because the Workforce Development Board didn't screen those people out, all got jobs working mostly for federal government entities locally. Or state government, because they're looking for those specific certificates. We actually did at the Michigan Economic Development Corporation level an analysis of all the resumes in the state system looking for those cybersecurity credentials, and found almost no employers in Michigan 7 years ago even asking for those credentials. Where you go to Virginia and Maryland, and they were off the charts in their numbers, because you got immature ecosystems not understanding what the national standards are. I would argue, and Bill Shatrice said earlier when she said, you get these federal definitions of critical infrastructure, and we were working with the National Security Council on how do you create national cybersecurity training standards for industries. And I would argue, I'm a former trial lawyer, the trial lawyers are going to get a hold of cyber, and they're going to hit the auto companies in Michigan someday when laptops are crashing cars and kids are having a few beers and having fun. They're going to say to the engineers, why don't you have Security Plus? Why don't you have CISSPs? Why don't you have all these federally recognized certificates? So I always advise corporations to drive to the federal cyber standards. For our young soldiers and airmen that are asking, or young adults asking for advice, I say get your certificates, because even if you can bounce between federal and private sector, and our state government looks for those, and then when they get into state government, we drive them to those federal certificates as well.
And I think you bring up a really good point as far as what do you then provide the HR people, to your point, who don't really know what to, so, CEO comes in and like, I hear I need a cyber person, so can you get me a cyber person? And what does that really mean? Actually, one of the projects that we're working with the National Governors Association, Indiana was one of the 4 states that was chosen for their Cyber Policy Academy this year, is workforce development. But it's not workforce development in general, like we need to increase our workforce. It's more along the lines of how do we provide resources for the full ecosystem of the workforce? So from the academic institutions, organizations, the K through 12, the state perspective, the actual employer perspective, and then how do we basically have that same language? And to your point, when we look at NICE, when they are putting together career pathways, and while and I think Rodney's really great, the director of that, he's like, I know it's not perfect, but from my perspective, it's a start. And if we're all doing that, educating and providing resources and teaching the employers how to use those tools without creating too much of a burden to them, then we're now like all aligning ourselves to fill in that workforce gap appropriately, so that when the person gets a cybersecurity person, it's exactly for what that cyber need is. And maybe they really were looking for a cyber strategist or an actual person with certification. So we have to kind of figure out and get on the same page first, which we're going to be implementing and looking to do across all the state in Indiana. And so, I mean, it's a huge challenge because we have to make sure businesses, it doesn't feel like an unfunded mandate because we all love those so much. But really, it's really to help them know what to ask and how to get that filled.
Right, and one more thing, what we've done in Michigan is we pursued and obtained a OSD, Office Economic Adjustment grant for cyber, and we mapped the cyber ecosystem in most of lower southeast Michigan. And why is that important? Because we worked with the Workforce Intelligence Network, the Community College Network in southern Michigan. And what we found and what we know is some employers will take, for instance, people like any guardsman with a clearance, any reservist with a clearance, entry level, I'll hire you. And when you start mapping out the wages, a couple of companies have said, I can't keep them after 2 years because they're worth too much. So what you do is you align, there's a Royal Oak company that will take any guardsman reservist with a clearance, entry level, and teach them. They used to start at $15 an hour. I think they're up to $20 an hour. Year 2, you make $30 an hour, and year 3, they expect you to be gone. So what we do is started to align those companies to say, we'll give you all the fresh talent, and then all the graduates go into these other pipelines and these other companies that want the 3 to 5 years. So if you're in that market, you want to start networking what the levels are and get those companies aligned and get those pipelines built from entry level up.
And apprenticeship programs.
Yes.
When you're talking about how do you fill that gap from like a newbie that just came out and I'm like, I got my cert, to somebody that they really just need to know that they actually can, do it. Those apprenticeship programs that I think a lot of states are starting to develop around cyber are going to be key to that.
Yeah, and our State Department of Technology and Management budget averages 100 IT job vacancies at a time. And so we've got it worked out as a pipeline. Any brand new guardsman gets their clearance, goes to Fort Gordon, comes back. They know where to plug them in. They give them preference because they're veterans or uniformed and hiring, and they get that experience, and they don't expect to keep them that long if they don't have upward mobility.
Yeah, go work for the state.
Yes.
Let's take 2 more questions, and then we'll close this one and that one. And
Hey, how are you?
we've got a microphone coming.
So, General Stone, I've been a fan of you since Iraq.
Thank
The operations. We've met before. So
Yes, you look familiar. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to make 3 points, and there's questions involved. It's not just FOIA reform and NDAs, but tort reform to protect those that fail from legal harm and promote collaboration and information sharing. It's not just near peer and non-state actors, but hacktivists and criminal groups. It's not just state-to-state partnerships, but city-to-city partnerships. There's a lot of international ties that way. It's not just the National Guard, but harnessing Reserve Command talent and skills. I loved what you said, sir, about the flipping of Title 10 and Title 32, but why not flip with the private sector, especially banking and tech companies? So the key is to get talent from the federal level to the local level. That's really the great big sucking hole, and I really appreciate what all of you said.
And can we take the last question right back there, very quickly?
Thank you. I agree.
And then you all can respond.
Hi guys, Sam Baines from a company called With You, With Me. Back to the last question about workforce development. How much of the source of all the problems that we have is just a lack of enough trained, cleared people across the government sector, the commercial sector, as well as the military sector? And if I could build for you a workforce in each of your states to fill all your gaps in 6 months, would that solve a lot of those problems?
Well, I'd be curious, and I would definitely route you to the right people to help with the gap fill. Matter of fact, I had a meeting at Merit yesterday with some folks from the University of Michigan on the gap filling, or at least the software to identify the gaps, I should say, not actually do the gap filling. But that's something I think we're all always interested in sharing, and that's why Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, other states host cybersecurity conferences. We're always looking for those new, fresh ideas to come in. As a matter of fact, in Michigan, our conference is a week from Monday, and we solicit for-profit companies to give their ideas, and then we have a panel in state government that scores them, and the best ideas get to present at that conference. So please get with us offline about that and the skill gap. And, we're always looking for new ideas. I know Indiana's, we're all pretty progressive in cyber, or we wouldn't be here, so.
And I think, I think to all her points, very well taken, I think, for sure. I think, one of the things about state to state, you're right. I mean, when it comes down to the local level, the city to cities and municipalities, they're as in much need, if not more need, than the state to states. And so that's why I think, at least from our council's perspective, and I definitely know the states sitting beside me have made that a priority, we have local government representation on our council to talk about their struggles as far as, in Indiana, we have property tax caps. So basically their budget that comes in is capped, but then you have this need that is continuing to grow and is more expensive. How do you cross that over? And then I think the philosophical question becomes, when is it really not a local problem and a state problem when it comes to cybersecurity? Because those critical infrastructures are all connected to larger infrastructures that then the state does oversee. And so having those discussions, and I think most certainly from my perspective, our council, his goal is to, I know, like, for example, I tell large companies on the council and people who are obviously experts and sophisticated in the field, I know you know what to do, and I know you have a team of like 10 cyber people who do it. I need you to give that to me, best practice it, put it in regular people's terms, because we need to give that to the people who can't afford the cyber team. And then how do we bring that, kind of fill that gap in from that perspective?
Yeah, and I'll just add, because we're doing surveys down to the local level and asking them what their specific needs are, and let those get funneled back up to the top. And, instead of trying to, guess at what their gaps are and what their shortages are, we're looking to get those surveys out and get them back, and then do the analysis on it and see what we need to do to better support them. And, I think that's going to help out, as far as the local level goes.
Yeah, so city to city in Michigan, we actually are doing regionalization, and they're doing the cyber range exercises. The problem we have is the two strongest ecosystems are Ann Arbor and Grand Rapids. And so those two play with each other all the time in the Michigan Cyber Range. What we're trying to do is create cyber range hubs in like the Upper Peninsula. Marquette, Michigan just is opening one. But their ecosystems are mature, and I can tell you they're going to get their butts kicked by the other cities. But there is a program. The Army Cyber Institute hosts. They've hosted now 2 Jack Voltaic exercises, one in New York City, one in Houston. I've recently become an advisor to the Army Cyber Institute. And in the city of Houston, the city manager and the city decided the scenario, and they used a hurricane natural disaster port cyber attack. But we brought in the Army Reserve. We're bringing in all elements, the National Guard, everybody, and they're walking through the incident command system and up to FEMA and how everything fits. And it was interesting to me when I went to coach for a day in Houston, how many people were trained in the incident command system. They just had a hurricane, but they didn't want to exercise the system for cyber. And so it's going to have to be turns. But your idea of the city-to-city international is one we haven't talked about. That is a great idea that I can take up. I'll be talking to Guy Walsh at Cyber Command and see, we'll maybe pick, I've got to talk to the Army Cyber Institute and be on a panel next month. I'll explore that idea with them, because they have not picked their next city yet. And maybe when we pick the city, we pick an international partner city. Think about academic. No, absolutely. We want academic as part of that. That's part of why we picked Merit, and why we're reaching out to Texas A&M and George Washington University. And we want the universities, Georgia Tech and all the top schools, USC, I could shut them out here. They're sponsoring today. We've worked with Cal Poly, and we've worked with Purdue, and and things along those lines. So yeah, we're definitely open to all that.
I think the city of Indianapolis actually just announced a city sister partnership with Israel, actually. I believe Tel Aviv. Yeah, I believe. We're they're looking at it from a general kind of city management, but as we like delineate that further and further, most certainly because Israel is most certainly one of the foremost countries when it comes to cyber, we're talking a lot with Israel right now. Actually, we have Cyber Tech coming next week, and then the next week Michigan. But they're a company that's out of Israel that we're doing a lot of partnership with Indiana too. So.
Yeah, and I think we need to take this back to the National Guard Bureau too, because they do a couple national level exercises. One, Cyber Shield.
Yeah.
They bring a lot of the industry partners there, and I know they're ramping up for the one for 2019. You got Cyber Guard, and then I know with Northcom, we actually have the Northcom rep coming to our commission meeting to talk about Vista Pulse exercise. And so I do think, to speak to your point, we definitely need to add them to the exercise agenda.
Well, thank you to our wonderful panelists and to USC and NGA for partnering on this event. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, man. Great.
And we are going to continue our live coverage here on C-SPAN.